certainly interesting. I wouldn't rule that out, and certainly, whilst that seems very narrow, I think this wider point is really important. So it's thinking whether that's the best way forward to tackle that or not. But I have absolute sympathy if that's the kind of thing we're doing for police. I must admit, that's not one I've heard particularly with St James's local action teams involved in last week, as is Ben. Because actually the police there have been very proactive in ticketing people earlier in the evening and say that we ought to start, your behaviour starts to get out of order, we're imposing a fine at this stage, and that has tended to stop things getting much worse. So some of those crime figures have looked bad because a lot more people are getting early intervention, but what you're not getting is the tail end of really nasty, violent, some of the worst behaviour at the tail end, because frankly people are 80 quid or whatever it is lighter at that point, and they've not as much to spend in the bar and whatever else. But it has tackled quite a bit of that behaviour. I'm possibly unusual in that I was never very convinced about the idea of 24/7 drinking. I just didn't see, particularly in a city like ours, how that was going to work without having a major impact on residents. And frankly, I don't think it's particularly good for the economy. I mean, like yourself, someone who work in business, I don't think it's particularly helpful if someone comes in having been out drinking till 4 o'clock in the morning. So, I mean, that sounds very illiberal, but I think, there is an extreme. Do we really need drinking all night, every day of the week? The practical reality is that lots of places don't open on those kind of hours because people haven't got the appetite for it. But I think, we went too far too quickly. The government, in a sense, is starting to backtrack on that. Certainly, I'm always concerned if police say they can't tackle those situations. So, my experience in St James is more and more resources in, and I think a lot of those problems, have improved quite significantly. Certainly, in terms of the hate crimes that's come, tends to happen late at night when people are drunk, the kind of vandalism, etc. But that does not get around the noise problem. And to what point do we get where we say police spend all their time telling someone off for being loud in the street? Or do we recognise that, frankly, if somewhere is open till 4 o'clock in the morning around the corner, that's really the cause, and therefore we should tackle that problem.
Thank you, Julia.
Well, as somebody who would be quite well placed to draft legislation, there seems to me an obvious definition which could be used. There's already a legal definition of when you're too drunk to drive a car. Now, I suspect that most people wouldn't want to see that being defined as being drunk for purposes of walking on the pavement, for example. Certainly not any bars, clubs or retailers of alcohol. And I think such a definition might be harmful to the local economy. But it seems to me that there's a prior question. You've already said that the police are not enforcing the existing legislation. Well, I'm not sure. In fact, I'm quite sure that the answer is not to have new legislation. And one of the things that concerns me is you say the police are unable to put resources in. Well, as Liberal Democrats, we would like to see more resources for frontline policing instead of spending money on the ID card scheme. And we'd like to see the police being well-resourced and community safety initiatives being well-resourced. And I'm not convinced that there's a need for new legislation rather than using the legislation that's already there. In terms of problems on the streets, there are also powers that can be used by licensing committees in local government. So I'd like to see well-resourced community safety teams, well-resourced police, applying the existing legislation and to see where that gets us. I think there is an obvious definition which could be used of being too drunk, because we do in fact define in terms of alcohol content per unit of blood in motoring offences. We could set a different level that was for other purposes, but I wouldn't want to introduce a private member's bill before I've seen well-resourced police enforce the existing legislation.
Okay, thank you. Charlotte?
Oh dear, I'd get into trouble in Juliet's world, I definitely would. I obviously wouldn't like to see any sort of taking away of civil liberties, having milligrams of alcohol in your blood. I just don't think that that's the way forward. But I've been looking at this quite a lot recently, and of course, the nighttime economy is a critical contributor to our diverse economy. A Conservative government will look very closely at the 24-hour licensing, and I do believe it will probably end it. I went and spoke to Chief Superintendent Graham Bartlett the other day, who runs policing in Brighton and Hove. And I don't know about you, but I'm only 41. And when I was a lass and I used to go out drinking, there wasn't a huge police presence on the streets. We've got to this stage now where there's a standoff between drinkers and police. Now, they get on perfectly well, but we seem to be throwing an enormous amount of resources at just maintaining this sort of status quo, when actually we want things to get better, because it costs a huge amount of money. And you know, they've got an incredible process of how they police Brighton and Hove on a Friday and Saturday night. Why do we need this? How are we going to make it better? It shouldn't be that way. So I'm just continuing to talk to the police because I think it's very interesting. And you asked would I introduce a private members bill. Well, I don't know. I've got Chris Grading coming down tomorrow. So I'm actually going to ask him what we're going to do about it. So I'm taking him up to the Hollingbury Detention Centre, which of course we travel with drug people anyway. So whilst I'm up there, I shall talk to the police up there. I'm going to ask Chris Grading and tell him this question was raised. And if you let me have your card, I'll happily tell you what he says afterwards.
Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you, Ben.
Well, thank you. I mean, again, I'm going to sort of cop out the crunch question. I would say that I think the crunch question about the private members bill, simply because I think the current system we've got in Parliament means there's just a ballot, a very small number of MPs get to present things, and pretty much one thing each, and they're very lucky. And I don't know whether this will be, if I'm honest, the number one priority of the change we need to see in this city or in this society that I could deliver. It might be the number one priority, but that's one to wait and see, and maybe not. But I think in terms of the broader issue, there is, as Juliet said, there's quite a lot of existing legislation that isn't being used. And in particular, there's the Violent Crime Reduction Act, which has got powers within it to enhance the ability of local councils and police to gain resources from licensed premises where there is a particular community problem. Now, that's something that would be very unpopular with licensed premises, of course, because there would be no putting their hands in their pocket in a way that the licensing regime would normally allow, because under the existing rules, to make any charges for a license, they've got to be dependent on what it actually costs to administer the whole scheme. You can't make charges as a council or as the police to licensed premises to contribute to the cost of the policing or the noise patrol officers in the environmental health department or anything else. But there is legislation that would allow this. The Sussex Police and Brighton and Hove City Council's chief executive are currently very opposed to using it because they think to use it would be a bit using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. I'm not sure that that's the case because in lifetime I regularly go to lap meetings in the St James Street area, and we do hear from the police in a different way to the way that you were summarising for the whole city. That at least in the St James's Street, I feel they are able to put sufficient resources into it. But nonetheless, every single meeting there is a queue of people, residents and local businesses, with tales of woe about how they're being disturbed and how all this effort from the police and so on isn't working. So I think we have to be quite radical about looking at using existing legislation. The final thing I would say is that one of my roles, as well as being a member of the City Council, is to represent the City and Sussex Police Authority, which allows me to have a much broader look at the way that the police across Sussex are resourced in these issues. One thing that's terribly depressing is a few months ago, before the most recent budget process, the Chief Constable of Sussex basically put his hands up and said, we're going to have to make £35 million worth of cuts to policing over 5 years in Sussex. We can't rule anything out or anything in, and that includes losing jobs and basically making police officers redundant. The reason for these cuts, there are a number of, if you like, immediate reasons why we're facing this shortfall, but the biggest one is a derisory settlement from central government. Sussex is one of the most poorly funded police forces in the country. I believe that it should be, funded in exactly the same way as all the other forces in the country. It should get a lot more money from the government. Secondly, the police authority itself has made a decision to put more of the council